My name is Pauli Vokel, and in this presentation, my colleagues Andrea, Linny, and I will outline a realistic settlement between Russia and Ukraine that we believe supports American foreign policy objectives as it pertains to decreasing US involvement in Europe. Since the end of the Cold War, the US policymakers have struggled to transition away from the continent and focus on other foreign policy objectives. The time is now to accomplish this long-term goal. By establishing a settlement for the war in Ukraine, the US will restore stability on the continent and create a sustainable balance of power that enables Europe to assume responsibility for its own security. The conditions that previously required heavy US involvement in Europe have changed. First, the German problem is resolved. Germany is a shining example of a liberal democracy that has maintained peaceful and cooperative relationships with its neighbors for 80 years. Far-right nationalism in Germany is on the rise, notably with the recent electoral success of the AfD party, but the German far-right campaigns for an isolationist foreign policy rather than an expansionist one. Next, Russia's sphere of influence is no longer a significant threat to European security. It is reasonable to call it a declining power. Russia's economy is roughly the size of Italy's economy. Militarily, it relies on a limited supply of outdated Soviet machinery. And Russia's imperial projects, including its ongoing attempt to annex Ukraine, have been relatively unsuccessful. Finally, European nations are firmly committed to burden sharing in NATO. US defense spending accounts for about 2/3 of NATO's collective military spending, and we spend 3.4% of our GDP on defense, while many prominent NATO members such as France, Germany, and the UK spend less than 2.5%. However, during this month's historic NATO summit, allies agreed to spend 5% of their GDP on defense by 2035. NATO's new commitment to burden sharing indicates it has the will and the means to assume responsibility for its own security. These three factors strongly suggest that Europe will be stable without substantial US contribution. We envision America's new role in Europe as a failsafe. Our first goal is to withdraw American troops from Western Europe. Western Europe has not seen war since the end of World War II, yet the US has about 62,000 troops in Germany, Italy, and the UK collectively. We ought to gradually remove troops from these three countries while maintaining some symbolic presence in Germany. We do not believe that Russia can or will march into Germany, so our minimal military presence is an indication that the US is still committed to peace in Europe. We will also keep our nuclear umbrella over the continent. Nuclear proliferation would only create a security dilemma that would disrupt the stable balance of power that we are establishing. And the US will advocate for European NATO Supreme Allied Commander. The SACEUR's function is to command and mobilize NATO troops, most of which will be European as the US gradually removes troops from Europe. This position has been traditionally occupied by an American, but it is held by a European who transitioned responsibility for European security back into European hands. There are also several strategic reasons why the US must begin to transition out of Europe. First, the US will have more resources to dedicating to countering China's rise in the Pacific. Second, détente with Russia enables us to cooperate on a series of other global issues, such as nonproliferation, trade, and climate change, as well as drive a wedge between Russia and China. We see China as a much bigger threat than Russia, and deep American entanglement in Europe is limiting our capacity to address challenges in the Pacific theater. If we do not create a settlement for the war in Ukraine, we risk escalation and further death and destruction, and these likely outcomes would keep the US bogged down in Europe. The war has clearly reached a stalemate. This map illustrates the lack of progress in the conflict. In almost 3 years, neither Russia nor Ukraine has gained significant ground. The Kremlin has continued to launch assaults on Ukrainian cities, but Ukrainian defensive capabilities are so advanced that Russia is not gaining. Just this Sunday, Russia launched its largest aerial attack yet, but Ukraine succeeded at destroying or intercepting a total of 475 drones, decoys, and missiles out of the 537 launched, proving that Ukraine has robust defensive capabilities and skilled troops. However, Ukrainians' counteroffensive has not changed the course of the war either. Ukraine's 2023 summer offensive failed largely due to Russia's layered defensive line, complete with trenches, obstacles, and anti-personnel and anti-vehicle landmines. The US is incapable of supporting a strong enough counteroffensive to retake occupied Russian territory or Ukrainian territory. Even providing Ukraine with more advanced weaponry will make a marginal difference. Both sides' countermeasures are equally effective. For instance, powerful tanks are destroyed by sophisticated anti-tank guns, and barrages of drones and missiles are stopped by precision anti-aircraft artillery. Providing Ukraine with a greater volume of advanced weapons or American or NATO troops would be a serious escalation that the US is not willing to risk. We foresee a reality in which Ukraine takes more offensive actions in Russian territory, and the Kremlin retaliates using tactical nuclear weapons. Ukraine's bold offensive in the Kursk region in Russia and its drone strikes targeting Moscow indicate Ukraine's willingness to bring the war to Russia. Just this Tuesday, Ukraine struck an industrial plant in Russia in response to the aerial attacks. If Ukraine decides to continue responding by hitting targets in Russian borders, Russia may retaliate extremely and employ tactical nuclear weapons. We recognize that Russia's slow progress is humiliating, and the Kremlin's desperation can easily trigger a nuclear crisis. Every year this conflict drags on, thousands of Ukrainians and Russians continue to die. Russia has reached a staggering 1 million casualties, while it is estimated that 46,000 Ukrainian soldiers and 13,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed. It is time that the death and destruction that this war has brought comes to an end. Ukraine deserves to be a peaceful, sovereign nation, and the United States has contributed a lot to achieve this goal. Both Russia and Ukraine have legitimate security concerns that our settlement will address. We will include assurances that NATO will not allow Ukraine to become a member or expand eastward. This means that the US will not conduct military exercises or make robust security agreements with Ukraine. The US will, however, enable Russia to deter Russian aggression will enable Ukraine to deter Russian aggression with defensive weapons, and we will maintain a stockpile of weapons in nearby countries in case of emergencies. The settlement will also include provisions for stabilizing Russia and Ukraine's economies. Sanctions will be lifted upon an agreement, and frozen assets will be gradually returned. To be clear, we believe our concessions to Russia are necessary, and we are still invested in Ukraine's success as a sovereign nation. That is why we will aid in rebuilding Ukraine as well as support Ukraine's accession into the European Union. We believe a settlement is in Ukraine's best interest because it will not be able to retake occupied provinces without astronomical losses. A settlement is in Russia's best interest because the war is not progressing, and Russia's economy will remain fractured until sanctions are lifted and frozen assets are returned. A settlement is in Europe's best interest because it prevents potential nuclear escalation that threatens the stability of the entire continent. And a settlement is in America's best interest because it allows the United States to shape the peace and partially withdraw from Europe. A settlement is the most reasonable, realistic, and advantageous solution for all parties. Now our military specialist, Andrea, will speak about Russian, Ukrainian, and American security interests in Europe.
As Russia's economy teeters on the edge of a recession and Europe increases defense spending across the board, it is clear that Russia is being backed into a corner. For years, the Russians have failed to make significant advances in their occupation, facing a Ukrainian force that has been just strong enough to mostly hold the line, but too weak to retake the occupied territories. Much of Ukraine has been destroyed and many Ukrainian lives lost to the conflict. Although Kyiv has done its best to adapt to a war economy, this standstill prohibits Ukrainian economic growth and embroils Europe in a war of attrition. Thus, we believe it is in both Russia's and Ukraine's best interest to come to the negotiating table and concede certain essential demands to put an end to the needless suffering, and particularly to allow for self-sufficiency in the European security architecture. Russia is a power that the United States has to work with, and any European security solution must have Moscow as a part of it. The following proposals are realistic, actionable goals that address Ukrainian and European security concerns to encourage cooperation with a Russia that has been so far apprehensive towards American plans for ceasefire negotiations. We will take Ukrainian NATO membership off the table, partially demilitarize the Ukrainian force, and fill offensive gaps in the Ukrainian arsenal with defensive weapons, alongside other economic incentives for both Ukraine and Russia that my colleague will be talking about further on. The war has been counterproductive and strategically disadvantageous for Russia in terms of security and economy. By distracting themselves in Ukraine, Other countries were alarmed and prompted to join NATO, one of them right on Russia's borders, adding hundreds of thousands of troops and advanced military capabilities to the alliance's arsenal, and undermining Russia's opposition to NATO expansion. And even if Russia successfully took the entirety of Ukraine, Moscow would then have to deal with a bigger proportion of their borders shared with other NATO countries. Additionally, a continuation of the war could continue to deplete Russia's Cold War-era stockpiles, and as time goes on, more and more resources are required to repair and reactivate these stockpiles, forcing Russia to invest further in older technologies. The war has also encouraged Europe to increase defense spending across the board. According to some recent estimates, if this trend continues, Europe is set to match and maybe even surpass American regional defense spending by at least 2030. A stronger Europe means a Europe that has more resources to expend aiding Ukraine, especially in the case of a quote-unquote forever war. On that note, Europe is proving that it is strong enough to take care of itself. Not only is it spending more on defense, it is also working on becoming less dependent on American defense research and manufacturing. European NATO members have stepped up strategically as well, distributing leadership across 9 battle groups throughout the 9 frontline NATO countries. These are risks Russia should be wary of taking, because evidently Europe is becoming better prepared to continue the status quo if necessary. As was mentioned, one of the ways to bring Russia to negotiate would be by taking Ukrainian membership in NATO off the table. Ukraine would not be able to join NATO anyway, because there has not been a consensus within the alliance regarding Ukrainian membership. Promises have been made for decades, but there has been no attempt from the US or other members that support Ukrainian membership to establish a concrete plan for accession. So, Ukraine could not join NATO, and no more empty promises should be made by its members. NATO should also not offer end-of-war security guarantees. No NATO membership can also be beneficial to Ukraine, because it can focus on attainable, short to medium-term goals that can help Kyiv recover, instead of on a promise that will never be fulfilled. The guarantee from NATO that it will not consider Ukraine membership anymore can also make Russia more agreeable to negotiations. Besides, promising membership to more countries has only served to inflame tensions with Russia. After promising Georgia and Ukraine NATO membership in 2008, Russia gained control over 2 regions in Georgia and later invaded Crimea and the Donbass. Clearly, one of the causes of the conflict was NATO expansion, so promising any further expansion is seen as a direct threat to Russia. It is possible that promising membership to Ukraine could create a split in NATO as well, fracturing the alliance and risking lack of cooperation between countries that support Ukraine accession and countries that do not. Consequently, we will concede Ukrainian membership. However, we cannot concede total disarmament, because doing so sets up Ukraine to be reinvaded later down the line. In fact, one of Russia's most consistent demands has been Ukrainian demilitarization. Moscow is demanding a Ukrainian force so poorly equipped that it could not hold back a future reinvasion. What part of this demand can we accept? Well, first, to respect Russia's legitimate security interests, Ukraine should not have access to long-range missiles during ceasefire negotiations. Russia's concern regarding these is not unfounded. As of June of last year, Ukraine has had permission from the United States to use guided multiple launch rocket systems, ATACMS, and other offensive weapons within internationally recognized Russian territory. Many military installations are located in southern and southwestern Russia, close to Ukraine. If Kyiv had these weapons during a ceasefire, it's reasonable to assume Moscow would be nervous about a possible Ukrainian attack. Thus, part of a ceasefire negotiation would require Ukraine to give up many of the more offensive weapons in their arsenal that can target deep into Russian territory for the duration of the ceasefire, such as HIMARS and ATACMS, and also a revocation of U.S. permission to use these and any other American weapons in Russian territory for the foreseeable future. Because Ukraine is running low on ammunition for essential defense systems, such as the Patriot systems, we would fill these offensive gaps with increased defensive capabilities, providing additional Patriot systems and ammunitions, interceptor drones capable of destroying Russian Shahed drones, and FPV anti-aircraft drones. Russia has been having difficulties coming up with bomber jets, which are possibly one of the greatest threats to the Ukrainian military, so a continuous flow of anti-aircraft weapons could deter frequent bomber attacks and drone attacks and help Ukraine stay on its feet. A strong defensive focus is essential in building deterrence during a ceasefire. The question is, what is done with the offensive weapons already given to the Ukrainian military? All primarily offensive weapons, such as, again, HIMARS and ATACMS, should be handed over to nearby NATO members for stockpiling. These are not meant to be kept by the host countries, possibly Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, or Romania, but stockpiled so that, in the case of a Russian reinvasion during negotiations, the weapons can be quickly deployed back to Ukraine. Kyiv won't have to worry about a swift occupation before the weapons arrive, because at this point they would have enough defensive capabilities to hold off the Russians until the stockpiles are distributed. If a reinvasion never occurs, these weapons can be slowly returned to their countries of origin or given back to the Ukrainian military according to the final negotiation stipulations. This method would assuage Moscow's concerns of a Ukrainian attack on nearby military installations or of an attempt to recover occupied territories. Ukraine wouldn't have access to use these offensive weapons how they wish, as long as Russia remains committed to a ceasefire. Simultaneously, Kyiv would be assured that the Russians would not be able to quickly gain ground while the Ukrainians are distracted or offensively disarmed. To clarify, this is not what is often called a porcupine strategy. We are not arming Ukraine and abandoning them to fend for themselves. Instead, we are being realistic about what is necessary to bring Russia to the negotiating table for the good of Ukraine and offering a contingency plan to prevent further westward occupation. Ukraine's offensive capabilities will be restored if Russia breaks the ceasefire. In terms of the U.S.'s goal of reducing its role in European defense, the U.S. would continue to cover Europe with its nuclear umbrella because no European countries really have the capabilities to replace the U.S.'s coverage. We also do not want to encourage further nuclear proliferation, so by still covering Europe, Washington can ensure the Europeans are not incentivized to increase their capabilities. Part of this diminished role in Europe would involve reducing American troop numbers in Europe to 10,000 troops in Germany and less than 3,000 troops throughout the United Kingdom, Spain, and Italy. These 10,000 troops will remain in Germany in the case of an emergency, so that combined with the 3,000 troops throughout the UK, Spain, and Italy, the US can continue to show an investment in the region. According to some estimates, NATO does not currently have enough deployable troops to fend off a Russian invasion of the Baltic NATO states. Although we believe this is currently unlikely, a sudden removal of American troops from Europe could possibly encourage such an event. Because of this, we would phase these troop reduction efforts throughout 10 years, giving Europe enough time to build and reinforce their military infrastructure. This is also enough time so that even if Russia decides to accept our ceasefire proposals, especially our economic incentives mentioned in the next section, it cannot quickly rebuild and aggress upon an unprepared Europe. These troop reduction efforts are contingent upon Russian cooperation, meaning that if Moscow threatened Europe, we would stop. The US could also encourage European self-sufficiency by promoting a European Supreme Allied Commander, signaling to European NATO members that Washington is prepared to hand them the reins of the responsibility of taking care of themselves. Although these provisions do not perfectly align with Russian demands for complete demilitarization, we believe that the aforementioned conditions are fair, reasonable, and practical in ensuring mutual security during negotiations and promoting an end to the war. Because both sides lack trust in each other, realistic solutions like these can contribute to a stronger sense of safety, encouraging negotiation, and putting an end to the death and destruction in Ukraine. We can achieve this by also placing enough economic pressure on Russia so that it understands it would be more beneficial to end the war sooner rather than later and to leave Ukraine alone. With that, I leave you with our economic expert, Linny.
I'm Linny, and today I will walk you through the economic terms of our proposed ceasefire, including the phased release of frozen Russian assets and our comprehensive plan to rebuild Ukraine, anchored in EU integration and powered by the US-Ukraine minerals deal. Our approach is grounded in the belief that long-term peace is only possible when both sides have a reason to cooperate and when Ukraine's recovery is not just symbolic, but truly structural. The settlement we are proposing begins with a 2-month ceasefire and an establishment of de facto borders along current lines. For Russia, this means occupying portions of the Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia and Kherson provinces, as well as Crimea. These borders will still ensure each country's access to the Black Sea, which is essential to their economies. While this is a difficult compromise, we believe it is the most practical path to peace. After more than 3 years of war, we do not anticipate either side making significant territorial advances. Russia's recent offensives have stalled, and Ukraine has successfully halted advances in key sectors like Sumy and Kharkiv. Freezing the lines now would prevent further civilian harm and economic loss, and gives both sides a real chance to stabilize, shift towards reconstruction, and pursue diplomacy. During the ceasefire, key Western sanctions on Russia would be conditionally suspended, but with a snapback mechanism in place. If Russia violates the terms of the ceasefire, including de facto borders, sanctions will return immediately. The ceasefire would be monitored by UN peacekeepers, with each step of sanctions relief contingent on verified Russian and Ukrainian compliance. A neutral peacekeeping presence will ensure legitimacy and reduce the risk of escalation. This framework offers Moscow a clear incentive to halt aggression without asking the West to give up its leverage at the risk of violations. It also provides Ukraine with a rare and much-needed window to begin stabilizing its economy. As part of this plan, we also propose a phased release of frozen Russian sovereign assets, which Russia has repeatedly cited as a central condition in any potential peace deal. To respond to this demand, while maintaining Western leverage, we would release 30% of the estimated $300 billion currently frozen across Europe. The remaining 70% would be released gradually, with 10% dispersed annually, contingent on Russia's continued compliance with agreed terms. We recognize that this approach may be viewed as too generous or too quick. However, we believe that the initial 30% will serve as a concrete gesture to open negotiations, while the conditional release of the remainder provides both a clear incentive for sustained Russian compliance, whilst also allowing the West to pause dispersal if commitments are violated. Importantly, none of these funds would be used for Ukraine's reconstruction. This is a necessary and strategic decision. Demanding reparations from Russia now would likely jeopardize any chance of cooperation. Instead, we believe a more effective path lies in supporting Ukraine's long-term recovery through other, more sustainable mechanisms. Ukraine has suffered enormous losses. According to the World Bank, the cost of reconstruction is now estimated at $524 billion, nearly 3 times Ukraine's current GDP. Entire sectors of the economy have been devastated. More than $84 billion in destroyed housing, massive losses in energy infrastructure and the transportation sector, and millions of displaced workers. Ukraine will also be ceding some of its most economically productive land as a part of this deal, which we recognize makes economic recovery not just a matter of justice, but of future security. If we want Ukraine to be able to stand on its own and deter future aggression, the US must invest in that outcome. So here is how we plan to achieve that goal. Firstly, we will support Ukraine's EU accession, both politically and financially. The EU formally opened accession talks with Ukraine in June 2024, and we believe it is critical to sustain this momentum. This means not only backing Ukraine's candidacy, but working with European partners to accelerate the process and ensure Ukraine can meet membership criteria. EU membership provides a vital framework for long-term political and economic reform. It will give Ukraine the tools to modernize its institutions and legal system, while opening access to European funding and trade opportunities. Crucially, supporting EU accession shows that we are not abandoning Ukraine simply because it is not joining NATO. The EU offers a powerful alternative as an alliance that promotes democracy and development without military escalation. By aligning with the EU, Ukraine benefits from a long-term anchor to Western democratic and economic values. For Russia, it provides reassurance that this is not a military threat. And for the US, it creates a long-term structure for increased burden sharing across Europe. We believe this is the clearest path to stability as one that invests in reform and not rearmament. Secondly, we will prioritise the recovery of human capital. Over 7 million Ukrainians have left the country since the war began in 2022, and another 5 million remain displaced within Ukraine. This presents a long-term threat to Ukrainian growth and productivity. To tackle this demographic decline, we propose guaranteeing pension portability and residency credit for those returning from the rest of Europe, as well as providing housing, education, healthcare, and grants to help over 5 million veterans and displaced civilians reintegrate into the workforce and society at large. These reintegration programs will be essential for restoring both labour capacity and social cohesion, which are necessary considerations for long-term stability. Finally, we will launch the US-Ukraine Reconstruction Investment Fund, based on the landmark minerals agreement signed in April 2025. While the fund is not yet operational, the deal establishes a co-managed mechanism through which 50% of revenues from newly licensed mineral, oil, and gas development will be directed into Ukrainian reconstruction. Crucially, all profits from these ventures will be reinvested in Ukraine for at least the first decade, supporting green energy, infrastructure modernization, and long-term institutional reform. Unlike short-term aid or politically fraught reparations, we believe this model more effectively empowers Ukraine to leverage its own natural resources to finance its recovery. At the same time, the fund is designed to build confidence among foreign investors, establishing the conditions for private sector growth and attracting foreign capital into Ukraine's emerging industries. This plan serves multiple goals. It gives Russia a reason to maintain peace and cooperate while preserving Western leverage. It helps Ukraine rebuild without deepening debt or relying on Moscow. And it supports American interests by stabilizing Europe through structural economic development rather than indefinite military commitments. To be clear, this plan is not a reward for aggression. It is a strategy for ending a war that has already caused enormous destruction and poses a growing risk of nuclear escalation. What we are offering is a pathway to peace based not on punishment, but on democratic values and sustainable development. If we want peace, we must start by building a future where Ukraine can thrive, and Russia has more to gain from cooperation than from continued violence. Now I will hand over to Pauli to conclude.
Our proposed settlement to end the war in Ukraine is the most realistic way to achieve peace in Europe. By cutting off NATO expansion, we assure Russia that Ukraine will remain a neutral state, and allowing Ukraine to keep defensive weapons prevents Russia from turning Ukraine into a vassal state. We strongly believe that these basic points can be met. Additionally, we are invested in rebuilding Ukraine and supporting its accession into the EU so that it may continue to develop as an independent democracy. By ending this war, the US will finally have the opportunity to partially withdraw from Europe. America's new role in Europe will be to act as a failsafe. We envision a post-war Europe in which European countries take primary responsibility for sustaining the alliance, therefore allowing the US to focus on greater threats, such as confronting China's rise in the Pacific. We believe that the Europeans are equipped and willing to manage their own continental security, beginning by committing to defense spending and helping Ukraine become a part of the EU. This deal is in Ukraine's best interest, Russia's best interest, Europe's best interests, and our best interests. To be clear, the United States is not abandoning Ukraine. We simply wish to see an end to the destruction and devastation that will drag on for many more years if a settlement is not reached. We believe that Ukraine cannot retake a significant amount of territory. However, agreeing to end the war puts Ukraine on a path to recovery by forming economic relationships with the West and ensuring its long-term success. Continuing to fight is not worth it for the thousands more lost soldiers and flattened cities that a drawn-out conflict creates. It is in Russia's best interest to repair its economy and also avoid a long, unsuccessful war. Europe will benefit by preventing Russia from annexing Ukraine and threatening the rest of Eastern Europe. Additionally, NATO will become stronger as member states commit to military spending. Finally, the United States will benefit from settlement because it allows us to transition away from Europe and focus on greater threats in other regions of the world. Every country involved will have to make tough choices and concessions, but in the end, a settlement benefits everyone and contributes significantly to U.S. grand strategy. Thank you. We will now take your questions.
Let's Rachel go first this time.
So as I have said all day, kudos to our team here for a very comprehensive and articulate presentation. I think every one of you demonstrated poise in your delivery of all of the information that you were sharing. So really well done presentationally. I have a variety of questions, but let me start with an observation that there are, to my mind, some inherent tensions in what it is that you have presented. So on the one hand, you said this plan would involve withdrawing troops from Europe gradually, withdrawing American troops from Europe gradually, because they have now achieved the peace, that they were meant to achieve. But of course, if they were there and they kept the peace, if you withdraw them, there is the risk that that peace might collapse. So there's a little bit of tension there. Similarly, you articulated a desire to pivot to Asia because of the perceived need to prioritize challenges in that sphere relative to those interests and our ability to meet them in Europe. But in order to prioritize Asia, you are proposing cutting bait, basically, in Europe and moving our assets and spending and prioritization, et cetera, over to Europe. So I'm nervous that there's a bit of a mixed messaging happening there, that you are attempting to signal credibility and prioritization of the Asian, Indo-Pacific theater, while potentially doing some real damage to credibility of the United States' I in Europe. So how do we square these tensions that I am observing? I also appreciate your attempt to say that this is an agreement that will be difficult for everyone, that there are some tough trade-offs for all parties involved. I appreciate that, but I'm not convinced, because my read of your presentation is that this is a seriously pro-Russian perspective. There are, to my mind, indicators that Russia, or excuse me, let me say it differently, that Ukraine is actually being punished for Russia's invasion. That's a real tough pill to swallow, not least for the Europeans. So how do we mitigate against that argument or that perspective? And then last but not least, let me just ask a small clarification question, and I probably should have started here, so forgive me for the order in which I have presented my, my questions. If I understood your plan correctly, there is a 2-month ceasefire, right? And it was the case that on at least the economic front, 30% of Russian assets, for example, will be unfrozen initially, and then the rest of the 70%, will be dispersed, assuming everybody has played nicely over those 2-month periods. But what happens after 2 months, right? Because if you have gotten rid of, or if you've relinquished all of your assets, and here I am just focusing on the economic piece, you have no cards left to play if you have dispersed all of the assets that once upon a time had been frozen. So can you articulate for me what the vision is here for the sort of day after the 2-month ceasefire period?
Yeah, I can start with the most recent question. This plan is to release 30% upon agreement of the ceasefire and then 10% annually. So it's not across 2 months, it would be across 70%, so 7 years. And that is contingent on how the peace settlement progresses and how the ceasefire also progresses. So it's a very gradual process, and the idea behind it was that there would be something material to tie Russian compliance to, so that they would keep being incentivized.
Yeah. I can take the first question you mentioned, which is kind of, if it's not broke, why fix it in terms of military presence in Europe. So we believe that there are other reasons besides U.S. troop presence in Europe that has prevented kind of greater regional conflicts, one of them being Russia as a declining power. Our other team mentioned this as well. Since the end of the Cold War, Russia's economy is it is the size of Italy's economy. Their machinery is outdated. There are several issues with Russia's being a great power, and we believe that it's declining. So we also see that leaving Europe, or we are replacing our kind of gap of troops and such with increased NATO troops. We talked about the NATO summit, in which 5% countries are committing 5% of their GDP now to increasing in military spending. So as we gradually remove our troops, new troops will supplant. So Europe will have a greater control over their own security. And also to clarify, our troop presence, we're speaking specifically to Western Europe. Eastern Europe, we will still maintain 20,000 around troops there.
Yeah, to add on to that, basically to summarize, we wouldn't just be removing the troops. This would go alongside an increase in European military infrastructure contingent upon them committing to continue spending that 5% that they've committed to recently.
Does one of you want to talk about Asia?
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Oh, I was going to answer on your second question about this being seemingly a very harsh punishment for Ukraine and almost punishing them for a war that they never asked for. I agree with you. I do think this settlement is a tough pill to swallow for Zelensky and other Ukrainians who want to keep fighting. But our underlying belief is that making Russia pay reparations or pay for the damage will only invite more hostility and more conflict in the future. And we don't believe that reparations is an effective way to prevent a future invasion.
Sorry, were you going to say something? Just for your last kind of section of the question, what kind of message it sends for U.S. credibility in the Pacific? We believe that by kind of giving European security over to Europeans, we are focusing more in the Pacific, and that itself should be initially threatening to China, because we are taking our resources and we are moving them to counter China and to address their rise. So rather than, for example, sending a message that, if we don't care about Ukrainian sovereignty, then we must not care about Taiwanese sovereignty. I wouldn't say that is an equivalence. For example, I mean, Russia is not getting that much territory of Ukraine. This is kind of where they've been pushed back to, all this war. Those 4 provinces, they already had Crimea. But by showing China that we are now in the Pacific, we can kind of use that like continued military presence as a deterrence in itself for a potential attack on Taiwan.
I just want to reiterate everything that Rachel has said about your presentation. I actually very much appreciate the fact that you've really gone down into some of the details and tried to figure out, how do we do this? How do we get, in terms of methods, in terms of resources, in terms of just deciding who gets what and how and why that would be fair. Good work on that. Large question. Throughout the presentation, there's an embedded assumption that you can bring Putin and Zelensky to the table. That because you have been so reasonable and so rational in your thought processes, that you can persuade them that it's now time to, we've decided it's time for you to knock it off. And we want you to look at our solution, understand how good it is, and accept it. How do we get around the idea that they might feel that they've been deprived of agency for their own futures? How do we get around the idea that we come off looking rather arrogant in imposing our ideas on another set of states that have gone to war with one another? And war, as we know, is not just about rational policies, but it's about emotion. It's about, we've talked about losses and sacrifice. There's a lot of emotion here. There's a lot of sunk costs in terms of blood and treasure. So we often, I think, as Americans think, oh, we can solve a great problem. How do we persuade these two actors to come to the table and to accept, or to at least negotiate, even if they don't accept everything that you've laid out, to accept a fair amount of what you've laid out?
I can start unless you just to begin, I think the tone we want to take with this is that it is best in both sides' interests. We want to, although we are interested in America's interests, we have been helping Ukraine this whole time. We want there to be some kind of advantage to them ending this war, and we want to see their economic recovery because we care about them as a sovereign nation. But given what we've said about stalemates and all this, it is in our best interest to help them end it. On the Putin side, we do believe that he is a somewhat rational actor and that he can cooperate on things. There's a whole history of U.S. cooperation with Russia after the Cold War. One of the most recent examples being with the JCPOA. We've cooperated on non-proliferation. That's a pretty big issue. And as well, Putin and Zelensky haven't themselves taken part in any ceasefire talks or peace talks, but the two countries have done prisoner exchanges and other sorts of cooperation indicators. To Putin, we would try to emphasize that the war is not progressing, obviously, but he may understand that as they're waiting us out, just basically keeping the war going until the U.S. just gets tired. But we don't believe that this waiting out strategy is a good one because, as we talked about, Europe is starting to ramp up security. I mean, we've seen Denmark and Netherlands receive the approval from the United States to send F-16s to Ukraine. So the Europeans, as this goes on, are actually getting more invested. So any kind of hole that the U.S. might leave, they would fill. And if we see that, for example, this is still on the Putin side, that he's not taking it, where he's not interested in making a ceasefire that's fair enough to the Ukrainians, we will signal that we're intending to keep the same level of aid that we have before to keep Ukrainians in this fight. That is not what we want, but if Putin decisively is not showing any goodwill until making this deal, we're prepared to do that. So either of you want to mention Zelensky and Ukrainians?
Well, the reality is that we know that they really want to keep fighting, but we know that it is really in everyone's best interest to pause the fighting. The Ukrainians have lost so much, and they would continue to lose so much if they commit to attempting to retake these territories. This is why we believe in the ceasefire, because we want Ukraine to be able to get back on its feet.
Yeah, and just to add to that, the Ukraine would take a lot to regain that territory, and I think they know that as well. Although there's a popular support to keep going, regaining that territory would either need a more levels of aid, as our other team is advocating for, and the U.S. is just not willing to do that. At the end of the day, we support Ukraine's independence, and we want them to keep this bigger chunk of land as Ukraine, and we don't want another Russian invasion. But at the end of the day, if Russia agrees to our terms, we are set in our terms, and Ukraine doesn't agree to our terms, we are prepared to leverage some aid to bring them to the table.
Okay, I'll start by being a bit repetitive. This is another thoughtful, articulate, poised presentation. These have all been very well presented, very well thought through. The only thing you really lack is there's no highway sign photograph. So that, version 2.0 can strive, for a more detailed presentation of navigational aids. I want to follow up on the point that Tammy raised, which I really think is at the crux of this issue right now, both for the presentation but also for actual U.S. policy here, which is at the moment there's no bargaining space. Right there, if you compare Russia's stated war aims as they've articulated them as of this morning, and Ukraine's stated war aims as they've articulated them this morning, they're collinear with none of yours. You're proposing a position that neither side currently accepts. Now, we may think that they should. We may think that it's in Russia's interest and it's in Ukraine's interest, but Russians don't believe it's in their interest, and Ukrainians don't believe it's in their interest, right? The last poll I've seen has 60% of Ukrainians polled opposing any territorial concessions to end the war, right? So if we're going to get a negotiated settlement, a bargaining space has to open up that does not currently exist at the moment, right? The Trump administration discovered this to its displeasure beginning in January, that there isn't a bargaining space. To open one up requires leverage. The bargaining positions of at least one side and probably both have to be coercively changed, so that the Russians come to accept less and the Ukrainians come to accept less, and eventually they end up where you want them to be here. So my first question for the group is, what sort of leverage do you have in mind? What coercive strategy would you propose, which would presumably involve increasing threats and/or promises to the Russians and threatening something or another to the Ukrainians, perhaps? If not, then the Russians are the ones who have to move all the way to this. So question number one has to do with what sort of leverage is going to create the bargaining space that manifestly doesn't exist right now and cause your reasonable, thoughtful, sensible proposal to be accepted? Second question I have is, I'm struck by how literally the same factual evidence on Russian weakness and war costs was used by both of two diametrically opposed recommendations here. So there's clearly something going on with respect to the inferences that we draw from the same factual observations that's leading the two of you, the six of you, to go in orthogonally opposed directions from the same set of facts. Now, I suspect that something or another in that inferential process has to do with a different conception of what American interests are in this conflict. So there's a question of what the Russians think their interests are, what the Ukrainians think their interests are, having to do with this issue of bargaining space. But then there's this issue of whether what outcome the United States wants or needs. Team B looks at Russian weakness and sees opportunity, and thinks it's in U.S. interest to drive the Russians harder and to get a settlement to the war that's much more Ukraine favorable, Team A looks at Russian weakness and says, we should push the Russians less hard. Presumably that's because you folks evidently disagree on what the U.S. stake in this thing is and what kind of outcome we need to realize U.S. interests here. Neither group said anything about U.S. interests. So I'd be delighted to hear more about what you think our interests are and what that has to do with where we end up. And since I always ask 3 questions, I have to ask one more. So let's do the EU. Why not? Well, yeah. For starters, we don't get to tell the EU who to admit. We're not even a member. So why should they listen to us? But perhaps more consequentially, a standard counter-argument to the NATO caused the war with expansion Mearshheimerian argument, which I don't buy, but whatever, another conversation offline, is the Russians couldn't really have thought that NATO was a military threat to march to Moscow and depose the government. The real threat in NATO expansion, according to this counterargument, is political and economic. The construction of a westernized, liberalized market democracy on the border, on the western border of Mother Russia, would convince lots of Mother Russians that there's a better way of doing things than they've got, and they'll throw out the bums that are in charge. You're proposing that we offer and somehow arrange for Ukrainian membership in the EU. Presumably the Russians are going to see this as radioactive, probably to a degree comparable to to Ukrainian membership in NATO, which we don't say we want. So, I mean, tell me more about leverage, tell me more about U.S. interests, and then tell me more about why the EU will be less threatening to Russia than NATO would be.
Okay, I'm going to start with the middle question on why our kind of interpretations of Russia's weakness. I think we differ in our views on this in that, first of all, the risk of escalation we think is significant because Russia is weaker in this situation. We talked about pride and humiliation in terms of something that Putin feels, and that, like, I think that goes into your later question about like why this war even started. I think that is definitely an aspect of it, and keeping Russia's sphere of influence. So we are very concerned about escalation in this sense, as well as stalemate. Although Russia is not doing very well in this war, they still can maintain that defensive line that we have seen empirically it holds out pretty well. That counteroffensive was largely a failure. In terms of American interests in the continent, I think we mentioned just we largely want to disengage from Europe. This has been a long-term strategy of the United States for a long time. We've been trying to achieve this. Like, since even during the Cold War, there's been this idea that we should pull back a bit, and that, you know, we are not the caretakers of Europe. So that is our strategy and all. This is our plan for grand strategy in terms of this conflict, is to leave it in a place where it's stable so that we can have the conditions to partially withdraw from Europe. And creating the stability is listening to Russian security interests, no matter how valid we think they are. They have established what their security interests are, and Ukrainian security interests. And part of Ukrainian security interests is, like Liddy mentioned, maintaining a strong economy that'll help them rebuild, because a weak Ukraine cannot be a strong one. So that's my answer to the second aspect of the question.
I can jump in for the leverage question. Well, I do agree that we are currently not in a bargaining state. However, as we mentioned in the presentation, we are willing to condition aid to Ukraine to a certain extent. It's not what we'd like to do, but the reality is that the U.S. does provide around 86% of rocket artillery, 82% of howitzer ammunition, 70% of anti-aircraft systems. We have real leverage within Ukraine. And in terms of Russia, well, we commit to continue providing Ukraine aid, as was mentioned before, if Russia does not agree. However, Russia now has to be aware that Europe will be more prepared to face it if necessary. Europeans have a vested interest in Ukraine, as we've seen throughout the conflict. So we know that an increase in defense spending in Europe means a Europe that is more prepared to handle the conflict if it needs to continue.
And just to add to that before Lenny gets into the EU question, I think there's also a difference between Putin, or rhetoric for Zelensky or Putin publicly versus what they're actually willing to get together and negotiate. We don't know what happened necessarily with the Trump deal. We don't know if it's because Trump has a different style of statesmanship, or we don't know if it's because of some factor that was like a concession one side or another wasn't willing to make. Part of negotiation is having faith that these leaders will have things they can concede on. Like no side should be happy with what comes out of this. There should be concessions. And as Andrea mentioned, if there is no goodwill on particularly Russian side or no intention to negotiate, then we'll continue to supply them the same amount of aid.
And on your final question about EU membership, I think a key element of this is that the EU has already opened talks with Ukraine about the possibility of joining the EU, and I think they're on track to join by 2030. But there have been concerns expressed that they do not yet meet membership criteria because of issues with corruption, and I think also the Russian minority within Ukraine is an important consideration. So I think our main focus is to ensure that Ukraine can stabilize and recover enough to be able to meet this membership criteria and then be able to join the EU. And on your question of why is the EU different to NATO in terms of the threat it poses to Russia, I think there is a key distinction in that Ukraine is not protected under Article 5 in the EU, and although the EU is a Western alliance, I think that distinction is extremely important, and hopefully Russia will not see the EU as a military alliance in the same way that it would be under Article 5.
Thank you. Team B.
All right. Our question is that, let's say Russia and Ukraine do both agree to your deal, and the bargaining window opens and there's success there. What is to prevent Russia from then just deciding that because the United States allowed it to basically get almost all of what it wants, what's to say it's not going to just start another offensive again against Ukraine or against some other neighboring country, thinking that it can just encroach and take more territory? And I know that you talked about the 7-year, 10% unfreezing assets thing, but like they already have their assets frozen, and they seem to be doing generally okay. So how do you propose really enforcing that long?
Sure. Well, part of what we believe is that Russia hasn't been able to significantly make any territorial gains. They've been stuck at practically the same borders that they have been for a really long time now. At the end of the day, assuming they do accept this, we do not believe that they would be strong enough to invade any other country nearby. Additionally, by the time that those frozen Russian assets are fully released, the rest of Europe would have pretty much become more adapted and have increased their military infrastructure capabilities, meaning that Russia would have to contend with the fact that the rest of Europe would be way more well prepared to hold off a Russian offensive anywhere else in Europe.
Yeah, and we have some timelines associated with these things. Like you mentioned, the frozen assets over a 7-year period, 70% for 7 years. Also, snapback sanctions, we mentioned that, and we're stockpiling the weapons in the countries around it for some time to kind of avoid that situation. Over a longer term, more closer to 10 years, this is why we have the troop withdrawals over a longer period of time, because we don't want to show Russia just immediately after this war we're out. That's not what we're trying to do. And like Andrea mentioned, Europe's going to replace that hole. And because we are providing a nuclear umbrella for the rest of Europe, we don't foresee any problems happening to, you mentioned other countries. We don't think any Russia would not be bold enough to attack a NATO country. We still want to maintain that Article 5 is sacred to the United States. Although we are moving troops out of Europe, we still have a lot of defense spending happening that's not going away, as well as our nuclear umbrella that we're keeping over Europe.
Okay. Violate the protocols. I want to ask one question. You also raised the intriguing possibility of moving towards a détente with Russia. Do you see this as a sort of, let's get Russia on our side to deal with China? Do you see this as, hey, we have arms control agreements that maybe would be very beneficial to both sides? Does this involve sort of saying, hey, Putin, bygones are bygones, don't worry about war crimes trials, and how do you see a kind of détente possibly, what kind of form would that take?
Yeah, so I can take that in. So, yeah, so a lot of the reasons, like you mentioned, for the détente with Russia is to create this wedge between Russia and China, because we are seeing China as our main competitor now. And so that's a part of the reason. I think there's levels of détente. We don't want to congratulate Russia and say, great, welcome to the West, welcome, we're going to let you do whatever you want. But like we mentioned, previous to the war in Ukraine, stuff like the JCPOA, that was an example of a semi-détente with Russia. That period after the Cold War, we cooperated on non-proliferation, which is an essential aspect of U.S. foreign policy. So those kinds of cooperation. Maybe like we still are a democratic country that wants to uphold our values and not necessarily like totally cooperate with an authoritarian state, but there are other aspects of U.S. grand strategy that we care about, like non-proliferation, China's rise, that we need to address as well. So it's a more practical solution than just cutting Russia off. They are still a big country that we need to cooperate on a series of issues with. So yeah, it's the détente that we are envisioning.
Thanks.